Hello and welcome to the End Hitting podcast, brought to you by the U.S. Alliance to End the Hitting of Children. My name is Humphrey, and I take care of the digital channels for the Alliance. I'm really excited to introduce our guest for our very first episode, and that's none other than President of the Alliance, Dr. George Holden. Dr. Holden is Professor Emeritus at Southern Methodist University in Dallas, Texas, and he was a member of the psychology faculty at the University of Texas at Austin for 23 years. His research interests are in the area of social development with a focus on parent child relationships. George, welcome to the episode.
Hello, Humphrey. Glad to be here with you.
Wonderful. I feel like every time I pull just a couple of sentences out of your prolific bio, it doesn't quite cover it. Would you care to just add a little more details for our listeners?
Sure. Perhaps my most important credential is that I'm the proud father of three wonderful children, now grown adults, and two of the three have their own children, are, I think, excellent parents. It's been great joy for me both to be a parent and now to be a grandparent. And that's provided me with both practical insights into parenting that the research that I engaged in didn't really cover, and also to see some of the challenges too in everyday parents' experiences. So it's given me a good insight in addition to all the research I conducted for about 35 years into parenting.
That's wonderful, George. I must confess, I knew that about you, and I teed the question up for you so we could hear about that. I too am a father, and we have that in common. So I want to jump into our discussion right away. And to start off, I just want to talk a bit about the U.S. Alliance to End the Hitting of Children. Could you, if you would, share a bit about the mission and vision of the Alliance?
Sure. So the Alliance was an outgrowth of a conference that I organized along with two colleagues, Elizabeth Gershoff and Joan Durant, back in 2011 in Dallas. And the conference focused on the problem of corporal punishment and how to change it to move parents and school administrators away from the punishment into more positive parenting practices. So the Alliance grew out of that conference as the next step. And since then, we've been evolving as an organization. We've been trying out different approaches to our simple goal, simple but incredibly challenging, is to educate people, everyone, but focusing on Americans about problems with corporal punishment and alternative ways of rearing children without any kind of physical punishment, spanking, hitting, slapping, pinching, etc. So the organization has a simple yet challenging goal of education and change society. What I realized early on is this is really a movement, and we encourage as many people to join our movement for the sake of children, for the sake of all children, to help them, to help everyone rear healthier, happier, more competent children.
Wonderful, George. I have to agree with your characterization as of this being a movement. So I'm coming in from more the lay side of the discussion as opposed to the scientific point of view. And I see this kind of as a very important step on the journey. We are evolving and we have to have conversations that address some of our social concerns. And in this particular case, we're talking about corporal punishment of children. So I don't want to get ahead of myself. I will ask you about the evidence and education because you mentioned one of our core missions at the Alliance is to educate. So I will ask you a little bit about the evidence that supports the movement against corporal punishment. But before we do that, could you share with our listeners what the goals of the Alliance as an organization are and have been and will be in the near future?
Sure. The goals are really to change people's minds and behaviors about how to rear children. So Firstly, and most important, as the name suggests, we want to end all forms of corporal punishment, all forms of physical punishment to children, both in homes and schools. In the United States, there are still 17 states that allow in public schools paddling and other forms of corporal punishment of children. And in the United States, there's still too many parents, even though the numbers are decreasing, there's still too many parents who will resort to hitting their children as a form of discipline, or when the parents lose control and lash out at their children. So, really, the primary goal is to educate and transform Americans' way of dealing with children into much more positive and healthy ways. We do that primarily through educating about getting the word out about what the evidence is. We'll talk about momentarily. There's so much research on the topic that it's well understood that corporal punishment is a very problematic practice. And so we want to get the word out about that. And we also want to encourage social change through legislative action. Initially, we've been focusing on school corporal punishment. And in the now 17 states, we're still targeting those to try to end corporal paddling in schools. But then there's also many other related goals, like there's I believe it's only 5 states currently ban corporal punishment in private schools. So we want to expand that to all 50 states. And we also want to, beyond ending corporal punishment, we want to help educate parents to be the best and most positive kinds of parents that they can be. So helping parents become better parents is also a long-term goal of the Alliance.
That is a noble venture. As a parent, I certainly can appreciate that. So I am African, and I grew up in a culture that still permits to this day, to a degree, corporal punishment. It's seen as a way of not only raising children, but making sure that children are raised right. So I can see what the challenges will be, or are rather, when you're tackling the cultural and the social aspects of this conversation, both from the side of the parents and also from the side of the schools where paddling is permitted. So I could see that we have our work cut out for us. I do want to discuss the evidence because I see this as really the crux of this discussion. If we're saying let's not use corporal punishment as a tool for rearing children anymore, the most logical question following from that is why? And I think this is where we need to talk about the evidence. So, what are some of the top reasons why corporal punishment just is not the right path? Could you just lay some of this out for us, George?
Sure. This is actually the topic for subsequent podcasts that can delve into the research in much more detail. But let me just quickly give a 10-cent overview of the research. So there are now literally thousands of studies that have been published in journals that have documented problems with corporal punishment of children. And these studies have addressed a wide range of negative outcomes. The most common and obvious outcome of corporal punishment used on children is the kids become more aggressive. Now, this doesn't mean that every child who is hit is going to become aggressive, but when you use a sample of children and you collect data about how they've been raised and whether they've been hit or not, children who have been hit and will exhibit more aggression toward other children, toward teachers, even toward parents. So that's the single most common finding, that children who are hit are going to become more aggressive, as you might expect, because that's modeled. But there's also maybe 15 to 20 other negative consequences of corporal punishment. Commonly, it's been found that children who are hit are more likely to be anxious and even depressed from that parenting that they received. They find that children who are hit are more likely to have negative parent child interactions. Negative interaction patterns are less likely to have open communication with their parents. They're more likely to have lower self-esteem. There's actually recent research showing that children who are spanked and hit are more likely to have brain morphological differences, so that their brains are developing differently because they are exposed to that aggression, which results in release of certain hormones, cortisol, that can negatively affect how their brain is developing. So those are just a few of the many different negative effects that seem to be clearly tied to corporal punishment and have been replicated many times. There are many others, but subsequent podcasts can delve into more of the details of those.
That's truly incredible, George. That's truly incredible. And it occurs to me as that this really ought to have a lot more attention and focus as a movement. What is your personal estimation of how much attention this discussion of corporal punishment of children is getting out there in the public, in the American public?
Interestingly, back when I started my research into this area, I remember some of my colleagues saying, "Oh, that's not really an important topic. Why are you wasting your time addressing that problem when you could look at more important, significant things?" And so they're really back in the 19, let's say 90s, there really wasn't much recognition that this was a problem, and only gradually has it been increasing for a variety of reasons. For one reason, the research began back then that I and other people started engaging in was coming up with these negative of corporal punishment. But another, I think, key source, which Americans typically don't recognize, but other countries have been much more aware and sensitive to, is children's rights. And children have a right, just like all individuals have a right, not to be hit. So, with the US Convention on the Rights of the Children, other countries such as Sweden, who began in 1979 to ban all forms of corporal punishment to children in all venues, and subsequently now there's been, I think, 65 other countries that have banned all corporal punishment. Things like that have brought this problem to the increasing attention. So now, these days, I see more and more articles coming out, individuals raising concerns about corporal punishment, speaking out against it. And it's been very encouraging to see that now this is now recognized as a significant problem requiring change and action in our country.
That's great to hear. The positive feedback there is great to hear. I would hope that this trend continues. I do know that the discussion on mental health is a big one, and we're hearing more in the workplace about mental health. We're hearing the efforts that the private sector, the public sector, are taking to address mental health concerns. And I would think that children, being among the most vulnerable in our communities, really their mental health should be prioritized. And if corporal punishment is a direct threat to their mental health, as you indicated earlier, then we really ought to pay closer attention to this. And that leads me to my next question, which is on community engagement. How can members of the public and members of the community get involved in the work of the Alliance and in this discussion related to corporal punishment?
The first step would be for anyone interested to become an ambassador with the Alliance by going to our website, www.endhitting.org, and simply signing up as ambassador. If people can make a small financial contribution when they do, that would be wonderful and very much appreciated. But if you're unable to financially contribute at this point, that's okay. What we want is more and more ambassadors to sign on and to spread the word about the problem and spread the word about what the research tells us about corporal punishment, both the negative effects and also the ineffectiveness of it as a way of helping children socialize children. It has a number of unintended negative consequences that parents don't realize. And parents might think that it's having an impact because if they spank their child, they see their child crying and upset, but they don't really recognize that it's not working and that it's having these subtle negative consequences on their children and on their children's mental health. So signing up to become ambassador is step one. They can volunteer with the organization and contacting us and sharing what their in what ways they would like to assist the organization, and then we can set them up with other volunteers to work toward ending corporal punishment. So it could be involved in contacting legislators, or it can be in helping raise money for the organization, or it can be in promoting one of our social media contests that we'll be having a podcast about. So those are just a few of the many ways that people could provide assistance through contacting us and sharing what their capabilities are and their interests are in helping to promote this movement.
Excellent. And thank you for that, George. Now, one of the things that I went through, if I could use that very loose term, when I first started to read the science, read the literature, and just study the research on the negative impacts of corporal punishment on children, it was a challenge to what I knew my whole life. And one of the things I wanted to know is what else is there? What other techniques would a parent employ to make sure that in the place of corporal punishment, we still have systems that can help us rear children well and teach them how to be disciplined and how to communicate, etc. So that's my next question for you, George, because naturally many parents who may find themselves still in the place of practicing corporal punishment, when challenged with some of these facts and the research that we're going to present in some of our podcast episodes, they want to know what else could we do in place of corporal punishment. So maybe you could touch on just one or two techniques that parents might be able to use to help rear their children.
Sure. Let me just say generally that there's dozens of things parents can do that avoid using corporal punishment that are much more effective, much more positive, much more healthy ways of rearing children than hitting them. And it starts really with how you see your child and how you respect that child's both individuality and are aware of his or her developmental level. So it begins with really having appropriate expectations about what children can and can and are capable of at the particular age that they're at. So it doesn't mean when we promote not hitting their children, it doesn't mean free range parenting or not trying to control or not trying to discipline children. That's not at all what we're talking about. What we're talking about is rearing children with respect, with respecting their individuality, with respecting abilities, respecting their dignity, and not embarrassing, humiliating, physically hurting them in an effort to rear them appropriately. But parents play a critical role, of course, in children's socialization and the critical role in guiding their development. But it doesn't require hitting the children. What it requires is so many different. Parenting is very complex, of course, any parent knows. And it requires understanding the situation. It requires things like being proactive so that you control the environment such that the child is less likely to, quote, get into trouble or to, quote, misbehave. If you really examine what's behind the misbehavior, that's going to be a key toward realizing what you need to do as a parent to help the child, to socialize the child such that he or she is doing what you as a parent want the child to do. For instance, if you leave out candy as a dramatic example and the child eats the candy because it's so tempting, and you're upset with the child because they're eating candy when they're not supposed to, that's really on the parent, that you control that
Right.
situation and not leave out breakable objects or candy or things that they are tempting to get into trouble with. So it's part of being the good parent is being proactive, anticipating the child's behavior, structuring the situation. Um, Children get hungry and tired quickly, so rather than letting them lose control of themselves and become dysregulated, it's important to things like provide food before at the point of hunger, and when they're tired, to change the situation so they can settle down and relax. And so that's part of what the socialization of children involves, having parents understand and anticipate their children's behavior such that they can create a positive situation for the child so that they won't get into what the parent considers trouble or misbehavior. But then, if all children do engage in problematic behavior, and you have to recognize that hitting a child is not the solution to deal with that. It's a young child, it requires distracting the child into a different situation, distracting the child into from one thing to another, such that they can then attend to, instead of, let's say, teasing a younger sibling, you can engage them in a different activity that they will enjoy doing, like playing with a toy or reading a book or something like that. As they get older, distraction doesn't work, so you have to come up with other kinds of solutions. But those are just examples of how the parent needs to think about what I call meta parenting, to think about their child and to anticipate, come up with problem solving solutions for their behavior, and evaluate those solutions, see how well they work, maybe come up with other solutions in this ongoing process and challenging process of parenting young children.
Incredible. There's a lot to unpack there, George. As a parent myself, I recall one of the most frustrating things that I experienced earlier in my parenting was not really understanding the stages of development of my child and understanding that a child is not quite able to process right and wrong at the same level as an adult would. And I feel that a lot of my frustration personally came from a desire to teach my child right and wrong, but doing so in an ineffective way because I didn't quite have the right language or the right way to communicate certain concepts or even an understanding of whether or not a child could understand these
Mm.
concepts at
Mm.
that age. So I can see that we have some work to do as
Yes.
parents.
So I'm very sympathetic with parents as a parent. And we had a second born was a very challenging child. And I would often get quite frustrated and even angry with him. But I never hit him because I knew that was not a good solution. So sometimes I had to put myself in timeout to calm down. But what clearly, lots
Right.
of things were going on. But one thing that the most fundamental things that parents fail to recognize is children's brains are developing all the time, and they are not adult brains, and their ability to self-regulate themselves is only slowly developing, and only actually the research indicates it's only till the early 20s that, for instance, male brains are fully developed in terms of the frontal cortex.
That's
Yeah,
incredible.
children do not have the ability to control themselves, and parents need to recognize that and then to come up with kind of workarounds, solutions to deal with that fundamental physiological, neurological difference that there is between children and adults.
Thank you for sharing, George. And of course, as the Alliance, we do have our blog that has articles that touch on a lot of these topics that we're raising, including positive parenting. And would love for our listeners to take a moment, when possible, to hop onto endhitting.org. That's endhitting.org, and go over to the blog posts section and see what's available there. And of course, we will continue producing more resources because I feel there's a gap there. We're talking about the research, but we also want to provide actionable resources that parents can use and add to their arsenal for parenting, so that we can do a much better job of raising healthier, happier children. My last question to you, George, is in your history working with the Alliance, what has been one of your most rewarding experiences, if you don't just mind sharing that final positive note?
The most, certainly the single most rewarding experiences is getting to know people who are equally committed to ending this problem of corporal punishment. There are so many wonderful people out there who care deeply about children, about doing the best and changing society to make it much more child friendly and respecting the child. And getting to know those people and work with them has been very rewarding and encouraging. That's the single biggest positive reward that I've experienced. But also seeing change occur has also been positive and encouraging, and seeing more and more people. The problem, just informing people. There's so many people who have been very surprised that corporal punishment of children still goes on and still goes on in schools. They're really shocked. So making people aware of the current status and enlightening them about what goes on and what needs to be done has also been a positive experience for me. It's actually, those positives have nourished me and kept me involved in this movement, and will continue to sustain me until we've solved this problem and we've changed the, both first the country and then ideally, hopefully, the whole world.
Wonderful, wonderful, George. And thank you so much. On that note, I'd like to express my thanks for making yourself available for the very first episode of the End Hitting podcast. We look forward to a lot more discussions with you, George, and with other members of our community, folks who are doing good work in this space in the fight to end corporal punishment of children. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you on the next episode.